that different side of research of looking at Ira Hayes and trying to dispel some of those false assumptions about Ira Hayes. So if you were going to try to convince a non-history fan to read your book, like me, how would you do that? Like, how would you present
Listen
that?
to my wife. No,
Welcome to Talk with History. I am your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jenn.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights to our history-inspired world travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. Now, today we are in luck because we are joined by Tom Holm, the author of a brand new biography on Ira Hayes, the Native American who raised the flag on Iwo Jima in World War II. Picture the Iwo Jima Memorial at Arlington. Ira Hayes, I believe, is the person at the back of that group. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But this book titled Ira Hayes, the Akimel O'odham Warrior, World War II, and the Price of Heroism. And Tom, please forgive me if I mispronounce anything. You can correct me here in a bit. It's available now, and Tom was gracious enough to join us tonight to talk about it. So welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us on the Talk with History.
thank you. It's great to be here. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce Tom a little bit more in just a second, but before we get too far into our conversation, I want to ask our listeners for one thing today, and it's not for reviews. What I want you guys to remember is where you can find the links you need to find Tom's book or any other books that we talk about on this podcast. So obviously we will link where you can find Tom's book in the show notes of this podcast. But if you don't want to dig it up there, you can always go to talkwithhistory.com and search for either Tom or for Ira Hayes to find the links where we have this book. So you can go to talkwithhistory.com, search Ira Hayes, and you will be able to find the links to that book so you can buy it on Amazon or wherever you can buy it. Now, our guest today is Mr. Tom Holm, as I mentioned earlier. He is a professor emeritus of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. Professor Holm has published over 50 articles, books, pamphlets, government reports, book reviews, and book chapters, and more. An enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation with Muskogee Creek ancestry, Tom has served on numerous Native American organization boards, panels, and working groups. He is a Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War and has taken part in several programs dealing with veterans affairs. So welcome, Tom, again. Thank you so much for joining us. So if you could you start a little bit on tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to researching and writing this book about Ira Hayes?
Oh, well, I wrote an article, it was published in 1980, about Native people in World War II. I did a good deal of work with the Veterans Administration during the 80s, particularly with Native veterans, or for Native veterans, actually. And got started on that, did a book, came out in 96 on Native Vietnam veterans. It's called Strong Hearts, Wounded Souls. I did another book on Indian veterans in World War II. And then a friend of mine, well, actually two friends, David Martinez, who is at Arizona State University, and then Matt Gilbert, who's at the same university I was at, the University of Arizona. They were searching for somebody to look into and write about Ira Hayes. And David and Gilbert, who were very much part of the Indian Studies programs at both these universities, recommended that I do it. And so 12 called me up and said, how about writing a book on Ira Hayes? And I said, oh, yeah, that would be great. I've been retired since 2009. I'm still working though.
I can absolutely believe that you were one of those folks who will just keep on going like the Energizer Bunny, looking at your resume and knowing a little bit of where you came from. Now, you said before we went live here that you're in Arizona. Are you born or raised in the Arizona area?
Oh no, I was born and raised in Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
In the Cherokee Nation. There,
oh, wow. Okay.
Which is the northeastern part of the state. In a little town called Chelsea.
Wow.
So that's probably why you wrote a book about the Osage. Did a lot of your knowledge come from living there in Oklahoma during that time?
Oh yeah, and that was one of my kind of mystery series that I've been doing. The Osage Rose. That was the one that kind of got me interested in the mystery. The third part of that. It's a trilogy. The first one was called Osage Rose. The second one was Anadarko, and the third one is coming out from New Mexico Press, University of New Mexico Press, and it's called Panther Creek. They're all place names in Oklahoma. Yeah. I've hung around.
Well, Dr. Holm, what I noticed what you do in your book, and I tell people, historians often do this. I had this conversation once when I was talking about the Battle of Little Bighorn, and I was talking about Lakota Sioux, and somebody had said you shouldn't use the word Sioux, and I had said, well, as a historian, you define your terms before you start, and you define your terms based on what has been used historically, what would be the more common term for people to understand, and you do that in the beginning of your book. I notice, and I appreciate that, because historians have a hard time with that, because every term can be considered derogatory at some point. Every term can be considered not accurate, but we're trying to find the best terms to define the people we talk about. And you talk about here how you're going to use Native American, American Indian interchangeably.
Yeah.
I have tried to stress using American Indian more in my grad studies. It was more current, so we used American Indian, but I see Native American as so much in the past research that when you're researching, it's easier to pull that term out. How do you feel about those terms, and what do you find is the best one to define your culture?
Well, I'm 77, and so I grew up with Indian.
Okay.
And so that kind of still sticks with me, and that sort of thing. But I think what's being used now, and this is troubling in a way for me, because I can't quite. Being so old, I can't quite wrap my head around it yet. Here's the term indigenous. And indigenous is being used a lot now. And so that's fine with me. I have a hard time using it.
Sure.
Somebody will say indigenous, and in my mind, I think of it in the lower case, and that it just means the same as native. I know that Aboriginal is not used anymore at all, although it was used 100 years ago. Native American, that's a pretty good term. Up in Canada, they use First Nations.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I think that it's all okay.
Yeah.
All these terms are fine. I don't care. I know who I am, so it's okay.
So when we talk about Ira Hayes, he's not. Is he of the Cherokee Nation?
No, he was Akimel O'odham.
Awesome. Okay.
Yes.
And is that from Arizona?
That's from Arizona. They're from Arizona. They're formerly called, some people still do call themselves Pima.
Okay.
But I use the term Akimel O'odham through that because that's the original. That's their original name. So I use that. And I was just up there very recently, gave a little talk at the Ira Hayes Library in Sackatoon, Arizona, which is on the Gila River Reservation. And Gila River Reservation is where he came from. He was actually born in Sackatoon, and he moved to a place called Bapchulim. And that was all on the Gila River Reservation.
Now, I believe when I was reading some of the summary notes and things like that, I mean, Ira Hayes received a fair amount of publicity when he came back. And there was lots of articles, and I guess he was pretty well covered. So when it came to research, I mean, how long did it take you to research this book specifically, and what was your kind of some of your biggest sources of research that you were using while you were writing this book?
Well, there were 2 biographies that were written about Ira before this one, and then a kind of a combination of combination of with 3 people who went on the tour after raising the flag. That was the Flags of Our Fathers. Mm-hmm. But then you go back to, a guy by the name of Albert Hemingway wrote a book about, and actually focused in on Ira's time in the Marine Corps. And then there was William Bradford Huey, who wrote a book. It was a book that at first they called The Outsider and Other Stories. Mm-hmm. And it was first done actually in a book that Huey wrote about the killing of Emmett Till.
Oh.
And then he combined that with the book The Outsider. The Outsider became a movie starring Tony Curtis. Yep. Mm-hmm. But the first movie actually about Ira's life was actually a television drama, and Lee Marvin played Ira. Tony Curtis played Ira in The Outsider, the blue-eyed Ira.
I know. So we visited Lee Marvin's grave before in Arlington. Uh-huh. He's also a Marine, but neither one of those men are American Indian. And so they're playing an American Indian. I mean, like you said, Tony Curtis is blue-eyed. And I even think Lee Marvin's like blonde. I
mean, that was slightly more common back in that era.
Yeah, it was. Well. It was part and parcel of movies then. That they called it. Well, earlier they called the white men who would play black people blackface.
Yes.
And then there was of course the brown face, and there was even at one time there was the term yellow face for white men playing Asian.
Yes.
There. Yeah. So that.
Yeah, one of the things that you had mentioned, and if you haven't heard the podcast before, I joke all the time. Jen's the history buff; she's the historian. I married into the history nerd family here. And you mentioned something that kind of caught my attention earlier because I actually hadn't heard this, but you said that the men who raised the flag at Iwo Jima, or at least a couple of them, went on like a tour around the United States. Is that something that happened?
Right. Yeah. They brought 3 of them home. There was Rene Gagnon and Jack Bradley and Ira. Now, it wasn't actually, I suppose, discovered until 2019 that Bradley and Gagnon were not actually they did not raise the flag.
Oh, wow.
So of the 6 that raised the flag, 3 were killed later on, and one who was a very good friend to Ira was named Franklin Sosley. And Sosley was from, I believe, Kentucky. And he was a young guy, and of course Ira was the veteran of that bunch, and because he had fought at Bougainville before, and really a horrible battle there, and then of course takes part in one of the worst battles in World War II on Iwo Jima. But Franklin Sosley helped raise the flag, and a guy named Keller, and a few others, but the thing of it was that they discovered that there were 2 others who raised the flag, and actually Gagnon and Bradley were not in that photograph.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so he was also a good friend to 2 other guys that were killed later on after the flag raising. And so he was actually the only one who was recognized who had been actually in the photograph.
The iconic photograph. Yeah. And the photograph, that's the second flag raising. So that's where
Right.
sometimes the confusion comes in, because there was a first flag raising, there was a second flag raising. The second flag raising is the iconic photograph. That is the Pulitzer winning photograph. Rosenthal took the photograph.
Rosenthal made it back, and he received a Pulitzer, and
Yes.
he defended that photograph for the rest of his life. Everybody was on him. And there was a big CBS radio broadcast that claimed that it was staged.
Yes, and that's not true. So the commander of the forces came upon the island and wanted the flag. And
Right.
he asked for it, it was a smaller flag, and he asked for it, and they cut it down. And so then they put up a second, bigger flag to be seen around the whole island. It wasn't staged.
And that was the picture.
And that's the picture.
Oh, interesting.
That's the picture. Yeah. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can. Yeah, the Marine who took you can see it in there. There's a film that he made of the flag raising. And you can see it go up, and it's almost at the same. I guess he was standing about 3 feet away from Rosenthal, and so you can actually see it go up. And then Ira, who was the last guy of the six, came up and then puts his weight on the flag to drive it into the ground further, and that was captured on film. And of course, the iconic photograph that was just snapped. Right. So
And I also stress that's not a flag pole, because they're not like
No.
bringing a flag pole on the ship with them.
Yeah.
Here's a flag pole.
Yeah.
It's a pipe.
Yeah.
They found a pipe, and they were able to put the flag on a pipe and put the pipe up, because so it's all symbolic in the moment.
and it was a heavy lead pipe, so
Mhm.
that's why it took so many of them to put up.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It was a long, very heavy pipe. Ira and Frank Sosley were the ones that kind of brought that pipe up.
Wow.
The other flag was on a different pipe.
Gotcha.
The first flag.
So while you were doing the research on Ira Hayes, writing the book, was there anything in particular, or maybe there was a couple things that you actually learned or discovered about Ira Hayes that you either hadn't known before, or that was surprising to you as you dug into this research?
Well, we've always heard about how Ira was kind of introspective and quiet and this sort of thing. He was, to a certain extent. He really tried to be, and this is very, very much a part of the Akimel O'odham ethos, is to be humble and to be generous and that sort of thing. And he was that, but he also had his fun side and things like that. There were two stories that I found in other biographies, that he used to open a beer bottle with his teeth, sort of thing.
Yeah, leave it to a Marine.
Really wanted to do with this after I started really getting into it. And I relied a lot on the newspapers. In the movies and the books that have been written, I think books that have been written are really before, except maybe for the Flags of Our Fathers book, were written before they knew anything about PTSD. And so I really wanted to get that out. I wanted to kind of show that was one of Ira's problems. The other one was the notion of alcoholism that kind of pervades what the newspapers and what you know about him. And I had to really dig into this, and so I had to dig into a lot of the literature on alcohol abuse. And actually, we have on our minds this kind of alcoholism that you needed every day and this kind of thing. Well, actually, Ira was a binge drinker. He worked in the fields, and on his home reservation, and that was incredibly hard work. If they were pick cotton or just pick crops or anything like that, incredibly hard work. And what I found out, of course, is that everybody, I think, blue collar workers everywhere would do their week's worth of work, and then on the weekends you go out and have a few drinks. And Ira was well known, and so he would go into town and people would buy him drinks because he was well known. The other thing about being a celebrity at that time, and this is the problem, I guess, with Arizona at the time, is that the racism in Arizona was very, very widespread and concentrated primarily against Mexican Americans, immigrants, and American Indians. They picked on blacks when they found them, when you put it that way. But Ira was well known, and he was arrested, they say. He was arrested about 50 times in about 9 years. So that was a bunch. And I have very, very strong belief that police arrested him because they knew who he was. Also, they were going on the stereotype of the Indian alcohol. So the drunken Indian stereotype that happened. And this is one of the things I think that the area was, they used to round up the drunks and then put them in this place that they called Camino de los Huaynos. And what it was primarily black and brown people who were thrown in there. Mostly Mexican, either migrant laborers or Mexican Americans in Chicago.
I read in your book, that is a narrative you're fighting against, because Ira Hayes had that reputation and people still think that today. And you wanted to, I really appreciate you went on kind of a quest to talk about PTSD more in a way that what did he have to deal with this? What was available to him? And that seemed to be the easiest thing, the quickest thing. And like you said, people were buying it for him. And at the time, alcoholism was looked at a lot differently than it is today. I mean, alcohol was a way of life. Like you think about in the 50s, everybody had drinks before dinner. It was the thing it was a normal part of being an adult, was a drinking culture. And I really appreciate that because that is a narrative that you see a lot in the newspapers and even on his death certificate. And so he's not given the chance that it was exposure or it was hypothermia, it's alcoholism. So, and here's someone who's dealing with PTSD. And at the time, people, like you said, didn't know quite what that was. The shell shock was coming. Into
the 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah, like those things were happening. But like you said, people were trying to show their appreciation. I loved how Dean Martin's family welcomed him in, and Dean Martin's wife, wanted, and I think he really wanted to be that to people, but he didn't have the tools to deal with the PTSD. And because there's no therapy, there's no medication, the only medication you have is alcohol. And that is hard to even regulate. That's what this young man had at his disposal, and ultimately it was his downfall. But I love how you're working against that narrative. He's so much more than that. And in a way, it's like most people who come home with PTSD and they're not given the proper tools to deal with it. It's like
they're going to self-medicate.
Yeah, and it's really a failure of the U.S. military in taking care of people who come home with this kind of trauma.
Well, and one of the things that we like to talk about on Talk with History is the lens that we look at a historical event or historical figure through. And I think it's interesting, and just talking with you, right now, is the lens that you were able to look at this through, right, come from your own personal history, right? And you wanted to fight against the narrative of the reputation that Ira Hayes had, and connecting what now, as you say it, because you did the research and you wrote the book, but you said, hey, he was probably arrested because he was well known, because there was, tendencies against the Native Americans at that time, and he was just out there drinking with everybody else, but people would buy him drinks because he was well known, and then he would get arrested because he was well known, and then is that plus the stereotype against Native Americans for alcoholism that all added up into what was probably a false reputation that he had, to your point. So I appreciate the lens that you brought to that, because it's not something that, had I been researching this, right, with my own personal background, I wouldn't have been able to look at it through that same lens.
No, well, I appreciate that. That was something that a lot of us came back with, and I did. You talk about it. You just say something on the order of, I had my head in a bottle for a while, and that sort of thing. And I guess it was a little bit better for my era because there was some help by way of the VA and that kind of thing, but there was absolutely none in that age. So Ira had nothing. There was the Veterans Administration existed, but I mean, as far as treatment for the 1,000-yard stare or the combat fatigue, they would call it, or something like that, that didn't exist. And so people would slap you on the back and say, hey, get over it or have a drink.
Yeah, where everything below the neck was fine. So they didn't know how to treat it.
Right.
They felt like you're fine. You're home and you're in one piece.
Right.
What's wrong with you? Has anyone else from your culture, from the Native American, and Indian, written a book about Ira Hayes? Were any of the biographers, did they have any kind of background like that?
No. William Bradford Huey utilized, he was really focused on going to the reservation and getting Ira's letters that he sent home. So that was pretty good research, and he did have those letters, and he utilized those. Hemingway primarily interviewed the guys that Ira served with, and that was really revealing. And whereas my take on it, I guess, was I really wanted to emphasize the PTSD and then go after this drunken Indian stereotype. So that was three different photographers and what you focused on. I actually feared taking on the job because I was worried that I'm going to be accused of bias. And to a great extent that's true. Gotta admit.
Every historian has it. You can't shy away from it.
Yeah. The other thing about it is that there was a kind of a stereotype that came about the movie The Outsider.
With Tony Curtis.
Mm-hmm. With Tony Curtis. It made Ira into kind of a bumbling moron thing. You ever seen a movie, Full Metal Jacket?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Matthew Modine takes over Gomer Pyle's thing. Well, that's exactly the way that movie, The Outsider, ran.
Okay. And that was nothing like the truth.
No, not at all. I mean, this guy qualified to go to jump school.
Yeah.
And he went to jump school and graduated really high in his class, and was one of the very, very few Marines who became paratroopers. Not many people know about this, and I had to do the research on this. This was going back to it, but there were two kind of groups in the Marine Corps during World War II that were really highly trained and this sort of thing. That was the Raiders and the parachute, and what they call themselves the Chutes. But yeah, it was pretty rigorous training.
Yeah,
I could never have gotten to it.
And you need to have some kind of intelligence to do that sort of thing. And so that says a lot. His papers today, his letters, his service record, where is that all held? Is it held at Arizona State or University of Arizona?
No, most of it's still on the reservation. Yeah. And they do have a library there with his name.
Okay.
And they have, and then there are family members are still around. And of course, he grew up in an extended Native family. And so these letters get passed around here. He wrote a lot home, but like I said, I went with the more toward the popular culture side of him.
Now, and he was actually in a movie. Isn't he in Sans Iwo Jima with John Wayne?
He was. Well, the three of them, Gagnon and Bradley and Ira, were in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And John is carrying the flag, and he's wounded, and he hands the flag to Gagnon and said, "Get up the hill." And then John Wayne croaks.
Yeah.
You know?
Huh. I don't think I've seen that one yet.
Yeah.
Right.
Was that his only movie that he made? That was his only experience
Yes.
on a set?
Yeah, it was interesting. Ruella Parsons, the kind of woman who was doing it, she used to write a column on Hollywood, and she wrote one article saying that Ira was going to be a star, and they wanted him to do a one movie. I forgot what that was all about, but it was interesting. It didn't come to pass.
Sure. So the biggest takeaway you would want someone, I think this is a great time to have your book out right before Christmas, and we just celebrated Marine Corps birthday. We just celebrated Veterans Day. Do you want people, the biggest takeaway about Ira Hayes, from me looking at this, is you just want him to see him more as a man and not a narrative. What would you like people to know about him that they don't already?
Oh, well, let's see. He was very much I could say it other than, he was very much a traditional Akimel O'odham person. He believed, and I would say that Akimel O'odham, they have just from talking to a lot of folks and reading about them and things like that, is that they're, one, very spiritual people, and two, the virtues of being an Akimel O'odham person. It emphasizes honesty. These virtues are very important. Humility, generosity, and courage. And that's what I've been told several times, that's what made a warrior. And so that rang true, I think, in Ira's case.
Absolutely. Even sitting with his grave at Arlington, I really felt that about him, especially the courage, but the humility. If you go and visit Ira Hayes' grave in Arlington, it looks no different than anybody else's. It's not ostentatious. It's not in a specific special area. It looks like everybody else's white stone marble grave. And so I think when you find people who are so humble and they want to be among their fellow soldiers, Ira Hayes is one of those.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I love that you've been able to again provide your perspective, right, and your research, and kind of and have that different take, that different side of research of looking at Ira Hayes and trying to dispel some of those. So I would call them false assumptions and kind of reputations about Ira Hayes. So one of the things I like to ask is like a close to wrap up question here. So if you were going to try to convince a non-history fan to read your book, like me, how would you do that? Like, how would you present
listen to my wife? No,
there you go. See, I do that all the time. It's, hey, if you want to read this, hold on, let me bring my wife over here. She'll pitch this book to you.
I guess I would emphasize that I'm really trying to correct stereotypes in this. The other thing I'm trying to do with it is that I think that Ira was cheated out of something too. There was one story that really Hemingway talks about, that just because one of the guys that he interviewed, that that served with Ira on Iwo Jima recorded actually what happened. It appears that they were under fire from something, and there was, I don't know what caliber it was, but there was a guy who got up and ran from his hole with an unexploded shell in his arm. Ira jumped up, stopped him, pulled it out, and threw it, and it blew up. Now, at the time, they didn't have the Navy accommodation or Navy achievement medals, and they put him in for a Bronze Star, and he didn't get it. He got a letter of recommendation or a letter of commendation.
Wow, that's surprising.
And so that was one of my, and later it turned into a Navy comment. What I'd like to do, and I told this to folks up on the reservation, I'd really to see that upgraded to that Bronze Star. And we were saying, yeah, I guess that's a good idea. So I got in touch with our Senator, Kelly, and I got a letter back from one of his staffers saying that the next of kin has to do that. Yeah, has to make that request. So I'm going to go back up to the reservation pretty soon and talk to one of his relatives, see if they can't.
Yeah, that's great.
Good for you.
Yeah, go at Kelly for a while.
No, and I think that is 100% true, because as a historian and as somebody who we've done Arlington National Cemetery a couple of times, Ira Hayes needs a more prominent story told about him. He's not a grave that is widely visited or even on the list of more of the notable graves, and he should be. He absolutely should be, because not only what he did in World War II, but his actual depiction on the Iwo Jima Memorial in that photograph, and what he did afterwards. I really think he is somebody who should be celebrated. So I commend you for what you do, and I definitely will recommend
hopefully
this
we
book.
can do it. I have an old friend of mine by the name of Billy Walkabout that I'm trying to work on that one too. He was airborne in Vietnam, and he actually saved a few guys. He was in the jungle on a long-range patrol, and they got in an ambush, and they were trying to extract his squad. And so the helicopters, they have an extractor to go down through the canopy, and evidently the helicopter itself wandered off. Billy got up and ran and was trying to get that extractor and bring it back. Yeah. And while he was doing it, he had to actually go in hand-to-hand combat with several Indian soldiers, and was wounded. I think they stuck him with a bayonet, they shot him in the leg, and all this kind of stuff. If anybody deserved a Medal of Honor, I think it's Billy.
Well, I will make sure that we have the link to your book, to the Ira Hayes biography that you wrote, in our podcast show notes, and as well as you can folks can search for it over at talkwithhistory.com. They can search for Ira Hayes.
I appreciate that very, very much.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And for those listening, thank you for listening to the Talk with History podcast. And please reach out to us at our website, talkwithhistory.com. But more importantly, if you know someone else that might enjoy this episode, please share it with them, especially if you think they would be interested in this book. We rely on you, our community, to grow, and we appreciate you all every day. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Jenn, that pilot was in the Army.
That explains it.
That explains it.
I always tell people the best pilots are the Navy pilots. When you have to land on a ship pitching and rolling in the ocean.
That's right.
And there's nowhere else to go.